BYOB, so we are getting our water. Note to Daryl, bring your own water. We're so pleased to be here. Thank you, Ben, for the great welcome. Liz, for those great stats. There's a very small but mighty team from GBTA here this week. 4 of us have flown in. There would have been a 5th. She has COVID. We still are in the land of everything changing around us, so it's so good to see some old faces and some new friends that we'll meet this week. So very pleased again to be here. And I will give you a little bit of a perspective on how the Global Business Travel Association sees corporate travel reacting in this time of change. This is one of my favorite charts from even before I got to GBTA about a year and a half ago. I preceded Liz in her role by a couple of months, so we are both fairly new to our organizations. And we are used to managing crises. So I'll stand here on the side so everybody can see this. We have managed through, and global travel on the corporate sense has always made its way back. I think what is clear is that there has never been such a big crisis as the COVID-19 crisis for us in the last 3 years. We never saw that big of a drop. And so our climb back naturally needs to be with some care, I think, as we go back as well. So the way that we see things coming back, this is a global view, and then I'll dive into a little bit of APAC. We think we will end the year on a global basis at about 65% of 2019 spend, which was about $1.4 trillion back in 2019. We think 2023 will have a measured growth, pretty good actually, and we should end the year at about 80%. And then from there, it will take us to probably 2026 before we get back to those 2019 numbers. And we're coming back in a different way. As Liz talked about, there are different things that we are concerned about as we go forward. What we also see is that from a regional perspective and a national perspective, that growth back in corporate travel is also coming back at a different pace. So these are the top markets that were there in 2019, and these are the pace that we see them coming back. We'll talk a little bit more about China in a bit. The US is coming back in full force, 42%, not bad. Germany, really good. And as you'll see then, I'll go through some of these other markets. Japan looks like a really strong growth this year as well. And as we go to South Korea, also on that list, and Australia, really notable in the way that they are coming back again through 21, 22 until everything opened, very much a domestic market as companies were figuring out how to travel again just within their borders. What we also see is that from a regional share, very interesting as you look at Asia Pacific, I agree with Liz, leads the world in terms of corporate travel as well. And so what I think is interesting to share here is that even in spite of COVID, APAC will be leading and getting bigger in terms of corporate share and did that through the COVID crisis. So in 2019, it was about 43%, and it's going to end this year at about 44%, again, as different regions and countries within those regions are coming back at different pace. North America also is right behind at about 25%, almost equal to EMEA, and then Latin America coming back at about a 4.5% of the total spend. So as we think about how APAC will be coming back, we certainly see that APAC business travel was certainly more resilient in year one than in many parts of the world. I think you had an easier start to COVID than certain parts of the regions that we saw from our standpoint. And as we saw that the global business travel spend fell to about 46% in that year one, APAC remained at about 52%. So above half, still wasn't great, but it was on still a very strong first quarter that was, the bottom didn't drop out of APAC as fast as it did to other parts of the world. I think in 2022, though, what we see is that while the rest of the world has been growing at about 34% this year, APAC has been growing at 16.5%. So this year has been tougher, as was last year for APAC than 2020 was. And I think finally what we see is that growth for APAC will match globally, getting back to 2019 spend on a regional basis by about 2026. What we also see from here is China is, of course, always, I think, the topic in APAC. And the fact that growth in China is slower than anywhere else at the moment with international borders closed, that is having a depressing impact on the region's growth in general. China makes up, in a normal year, over 70%. Japan remains the second largest market, accounting for over 8.5% of the region's spend, but that is down from 12.5% in 2015, which is notable as well. We also see, of course, that as we look at 9 other countries, APAC is such a rich, complicated region, of course, 9 countries make up 3% of APAC spend, because the big ones spend a lot, and the 9 here at this level certainly contribute a lot, and there's lots of interesting business travel going on here, but as a whole, it's a smaller portion. And similarly to that one chart that had various countries from around the world, we see that growth varies by market as well here in Asia Pacific. So Malaysia and the Philippines here, huge growth, and you'll wonder why those spikes are there. They had a lower point within 21 and certainly coming back this year, so they have more growth on a lower base. So that's why those look quite spiked, but I think in general, the region is coming back, other than China, at a pretty steady clip. China itself, what we see, will come back to normal in 2026. Their major growth will come, of course, as soon as the doors open. We wonder what revenge travel will look like as soon as China International starts going in and out more frequently without the quarantine rules. And we nevertheless see that there will be a lot of change happening there as we predict. Their growth this year is only about 5.5%, so that again is affecting the overall APAC growth because there's such a large percentage of what that overall spend is, bringing APAC down to 16.5%. Australia's business travel, certainly in year 1, lots of domestic travel happening through really year 1 and year 2. Of the 10 largest APAC markets, Australia saw the second largest decline after the Philippines in 2020, based on the data we look at in corporate travel. That said, Australia was one of only 3 of the largest APAC markets that saw positive growth in 2021. So the Aussies were traveling for work, and we expect that to continue. They will have an almost 30% growth rate in 2022 as we end that year in just 3 weeks. We're almost at the end of the year right now. Thought it would be interesting to highlight Singapore as well, even though they're one of those 3% group. Certainly, how many of you have flown in from Singapore? Yes, you are part of that business traveling audience today. Thank you very much. What we see here is almost 174% growth by the end of this year, again on a very low base from the prior years, but Singapore travelers certainly coming back. What is interesting, though, is, as you'll see from this chart, 2026 will not be still normal. There will be still some room for growth there, I think, as APAC reconfigures itself and corporate policies need to keep up with what some of those rules are that require some more thought. The other thing we did this year was we looked not just at what the economic data told us, but also what do travelers think in this global travel, the corporate travel world, as well as what do budget managers think going forward. And you'll see some of the data here, and this is the APAC view, and I'll give you a little perspective of how that compares on a global basis. So interestingly, and probably not surprising, 89% of APAC frequent business travelers believe that they need to do business travel to meet their business goals. I think that's not a surprise. It's actually higher, a little bit higher than the global average, which was 85%. So 4 percentage points difference that those of you in APAC value face-to-face meetings. We also saw that 80% of business travelers expect to spend more time traveling in 2023 than in 2022. That said, not all of their budget managers agree with them. So what we see in that last on the upper row on the far right, we see that 50% of the business managers who manage the travel budgets say that there will be more spend next year than this year. It doesn't quite match the appetite for travel. And it's actually lower than their business travel management counterparts in other parts of the world who said that actually they were going to be at 84% spending more next year than they are this year. So what we also see is that there is a large capacity to value face-to-face meetings more than the Zoom or Teams or WebEx meetings that we've been having. There is, I think, an overwhelming majority who believe that face-to-face meetings are important, that we can't give them up. And while inflation and recession are top of mind, and in many cases from the countries that you probably come in from now are superseding worries about COVID, the last column is still very important. COVID is still an issue, and it still influences the way that corporate policy will be set up and in the way that corporate travel comes back. So it is not a non-issue, I think, in any parts of the world, but there is actually more concern in APAC than there were in other regions that we measured. So just 5 trends that I will go through quickly, and then we will unpack, sorry for the pun, we will unpack, it is a business travel forum after all, we will unpack some of these trends as we go through the rest of this session today. So the first one is that there are new opportunities for business travel, and Liz talked about some of them. Digital nomad, who was that before COVID? Now it is something that probably those of you that manage corporate travel, either as a TMC or as a corporate travel manager, now need to think about what those policies are. There are also opportunities for internal travel. Those of you in the MICE field, now internal events are turning into events. They're not just team building, they are also now, you may have COVID protocols around them. There are other things related to duty of care, related to internal events that we didn't necessarily have to worry about before. So the new opportunities really, to me, mean that this is still a very complicated space. Your jobs are probably quite secure because there's even more to manage. And we saw over the last 3 years that corporate travel managers were sitting more at the table, the strategic table of their organizations than they had ever before in their careers. Second, people first. I think wellness, health, during any kind of pandemic crisis comes top of mind, but duty of care is still there. Self-service a must. I never imagined that I would be willing to clean my own my airline tray table, and now we are all open to doing our own servicing and doing other things, using a QR code to be able to order at a restaurant, for example. And I think that leads us into topics of automation and the way that automation got a boost during COVID, and that is in the travel space as well, which of course leads us to digitalization and the pieces about systems and ecosystems and what we're doing from booking all the way to returning home, how to make that experience a much better experience, as well as being better at measuring what we do on a day-to-day basis and what that means for the future of travel, which leads us to the final trend, which is all about sustainability, and ultimately making sure that we do for our industry what policymakers will otherwise do for us. It's very important that we establish measures and policies around those measures so that we get to 2030, 2035, and ultimately 2050 in a way that ensures that travel doesn't disappear from this world, but that it becomes the force for good that it really is.